There is a sound a wrestling crowd makes when the hero is in trouble. Not the cheer, not the boo, but a nervous hum that rolls through the building when the thing in the ring stops being a man the hero can beat and starts being a problem the hero might not survive. Every great baby face in the history of the World Wrestling Federation lived and died on that sound. And there was only ever one thing that could pull it out of an arena. The monster. The monster heel is the engine room of old-school wrestling. A hero is only ever as brave as the nightmare standing across the ring from him, and the World Wrestling Federation understood that better than anyone. They built an entire empire on giants and savages and creatures that should not exist. The monster did not need a championship. The monster needed only to make you afraid that this might finally be the night the good guy does not get back up. But here is what most people miss. The monsters were not all same. There is a difference between a wild man swinging a sword and a creature that cannot be hurt by anything. There is a difference between a voodoo curse and a man who is genuinely dangerous in real life. There is a difference between a monster who wins the title and a monster who becomes the entire show. There are levels to this. 7 of them. In this video, we are climbing the ladder of the World Wrestling Federation monster heel, from the bottom rung all the way to the top. We start with raw, uncontrolled savagery, and we finish with the single biggest phenomenon the business has ever produced. The one giant that even other giants were afraid of. Along the way, we will meet Vikings and witch doctors, movie villains and sumo champions, walking condominiums, and an actual wonder of the world. Each level adds something the one below it could not do. And by the time we reach level 7, you will understand why the most terrifying monster of all is not the one who beats the hero in the ring. It is the one who stopped being a wrestler and became a legend the whole world believed in. So let's start at the bottom, with pure, uncontrollable madness. Level 1. The Raving Savage. Before a monster can be anything clever, a monster has to be wild. That is the foundation of the entire genre. Long before the curses and the championships and the legitimate danger, there was just a man who looked like he had lost his mind, swinging at anything that moved, too far gone to follow the rules because he did not seem to understand that rules existed. And nobody screamed that energy louder than the man they called the Berserker. He came stomping to the ring in a horned helmet, dressed like a Viking who had wandered off a longship and into a wrestling arena, carrying a sword and a shield like he genuinely intended to use them. John Nord built the character on the legend of the late, great Bruiser Brody, right down to the war cry, that booming, repeated bark of "Huss, Huss, Huss" that he would howl at the crowd while licking his hand and bouncing off the ropes like a man possessed. He did not wrestle so much as ransack, and he was so out of control that he needed the devious Mr. Fuji as his handler, a manager whose entire job was to wind him up, point him at a victim, and then somehow rein him back in once the damage was done. Here is the detail that tells you everything about the Raving Savage. The Berserker did not even care about winning the normal way. His preferred finish was to simply hurl his opponent over the top rope and out of the ring, then collapse backwards and take the countout, because the act of throwing a man out of the building mattered more to him than pinning him. He was not chasing victory. He was chasing carnage. He feuded with the British Bulldog and with Superfly Jimmy Snuka, but his most chilling moment came against The Undertaker, when he took that sword and tried to drive it straight through the dead man's heart. A moment so genuinely unhinged that even the World Wrestling Federation, a company built on cartoon violence, had to handle it with care. The Viking even promised a Viking funeral for the Undertaker, and for a brief, eerie stretch, it felt like he might actually deliver one. But the Berserker was far from alone at this level. The World Wrestling Federation was a zoo of magnificent madmen. There was George the Animal Steel, the bald, green-tongued lunatic who tore the turnbuckles open with his teeth and ate the stuffing. A man so feral that fans could not tell whether he was a villain or just an animal who had escaped from somewhere. There was the missing link, the wild-eyed, painted green and black savage who headbutted the ring post for fun and could not be reasoned with by anyone alive. There was Kamala, the Ugandan giant, barefoot in a loincloth and war paint, slapping his own enormous belly and roaring at a crowd that had no idea what he might do next. A man so untamed that he too needed a handler in a safari jacket just to be aimed at the right opponent. And there were the powers of pain, the warlord, and the barbarian, two face-painted slabs of muscle who looked like they had been carved out of rock and dipped in menace. That is the genius of the Raving Savage. A normal heel has a plan. He wants the belt, the money, the revenge. You can predict him because you understand what he wants, but you cannot predict a creature that wants nothing you can name, and there is no fear quite like the fear of not knowing what the thing in front of you is about to do next. But notice the ceiling. The savage is frightening, but the savage is chaos, and chaos burns out. The Berserker eventually challenged for the championship and went nowhere with it. The missing link faded. These men gave you a jolt, a scare, a wild few minutes of mayhem. But a hero always gets to tame the wild thing in the end, because deep down a wild man has no defense. To climb higher, a monster needs more than madness. He needs to be a wall that the hero cannot knock down. Level 2, the Indestructible. At level 1, the monster is frightening because of what he might do to you. At level 2, the monster is frightening because of what you cannot do to him. This is the tier of the unstoppable force, the creature who soaks up the hero's very best shot and simply stares back unbothered as if nothing happened at all. And no monster ever embodied that more perfectly, or more literally, than Zeus. Zeus was not born in a wrestling ring. He was born in a movie. In 1989, the World Wrestling Federation produced a film called No Holds Barred, built for one reason, to turn Hulk Hogan into a Hollywood star. In that film, Hogan played a heroic wrestler named Rip, and his nemesis was a snarling, shaven-headed monster with a letter Z carved into the side of his skull and a single angry eyebrow slashed across his forehead, played by the enormous Tom Tiny Lister. They called him the Human Wrecking Machine. And then the World Wrestling Federation did something brilliant and bizarre. They took the monster straight out of the film and dropped him into real life, with a storyline that Zeus was so enraged at losing to Hogan on screen and so jealous of being billed beneath him that he had crossed over into the wrestling world to finish the job for real. What made Zeus a monster was beautifully simple. He could not be hurt. Hogan would unload on him with everything he had, the punches and the big boots that had flattened every other villain in the company, and Zeus would just turn his head, pound his own chest, bellow at the crowd, and keep coming. He no-sold the hero entirely. For a wrestling audience trained to believe that Hogan's comeback was the great equalizer, the thing that always, eventually, brought the Giant crashing down, a man who felt absolutely nothing was a genuine nightmare. Zeus stormed to the ring at SummerSlam, swatted Hogan to the floor with clubbing forearms, and locked him in a bear hug the champion could not escape. He returned at Survivor Series and got himself thrown out of the match for refusing to release a chokehold, choking the life out of Hogan while the referee begged him to stop. The story was never whether Zeus could beat Hogan. The story was whether anything on earth could even slow him down. It took a steel cage and 3 leg drops just to finally put him away. And Zeus was not the only immovable object the World Wrestling Federation built. There was the one-man gang, 450 pounds of unstoppable momentum, and a sleeveless leather vest, who would later be repackaged as the equally enormous Akeem. There was the wild-eyed powerhouse Sid Justice, a chiseled monster with a 1,000-yard stare and a physique that looked like it had been grown in a laboratory for the express purpose of ending careers. There was the gigantic Big Boss Man before his face turn, swinging his nightstick. These were the men the company sent out when they needed a hero to look up at something and wonder, for the very first time, whether his best was going to be enough. That is the leap level 2 makes. The Savage makes you afraid of his chaos. The Indestructible makes you afraid of his calm. There is something deeply, primally unsettling about hitting a man as hard as you possibly can and watching him smile back at you. But the Indestructible monster carries a flaw, and it is a fatal one. Invulnerability is only interesting until the hero figures out the trick. Sooner or later, the wall comes down, and when it does, there is nothing left underneath. Hogan chopped Zeus down to size and pinned him inside that cage, and the human wrecking machine left the company almost as quickly as he had arrived. Being unbreakable is a great trick, but it is still a trick, and it still lives inside the rules of a wrestling match. There was something almost dreamlike about the whole spectacle of Zeus, a Hollywood monster who stepped off a movie screen and walked into Madison Square Garden, billed beside Macho Man Randy Savage and the wicked sensational Sherry. The World Wrestling Federation was so confident in the act that, had the film been a bigger hit, the plan was reportedly to headline an entire WrestleMania with Hogan against this man who had never wrestled a real match in his life. That is the strange gravity of the Indestructible. You do not need to be a great wrestler. You only need to be a great wall, and the hero will provide all the drama by throwing himself against you. The next monster does not play by those rules at all. The next monster is not bound by the physical world. Level 3. The Supernatural. Here is where the monster heel stops obeying the laws of nature. The Savage was wild. The Indestructible was a wall. But both of them were still men, still flesh and bone, still subject to the same world as everyone else. At level 3, the fear becomes something older and darker, the fear of powers that should not exist, of curses and black magic and a creature who can hurt you without ever laying a finger on you. This is the realm of the unexplainable. And its high priest was Papa Shango. Shango was a voodoo witch doctor, and he was unlike anything the World Wrestling Federation had ever put on television. He stalked to the ring with his face painted like a grinning skull, a necklace of bones around his neck, carrying a smoking skull in one hand and a staff topped with another, clouds of greasy smoke pouring off him as he moved. Charles Wright, a powerful 300-pound man, played him as something genuinely occult, his look borrowed from the terrifying Baron Samedi of old horror films. Shango did not just beat his opponents, he cursed them. He was the very first man in the company to use the lights-out gimmick, plunging the entire arena into total darkness so that strange and terrible things could happen in the black. He claimed he could cause pain from across the building. He claimed he could make a grown man vomit from a distance with nothing but a spell and a wave of his hand. And in the most infamous moment of his run, he seemed to prove it. During a backstage interview, the Great Ultimate Warrior, one of the most popular and powerful men in the entire company, suddenly began to shake and convulse as a thick black ooze poured from his scalp, running down his painted face, a curse made horribly, impossibly visible. Another week, the warrior was shown inexplicably bleeding, or doubled over and sick. It was the kind of image that crawled into a child's imagination and simply stayed there for years. Shango did not need to win a clean match. He needed only to make you believe that something was deeply, a curse, supernaturally wrong, that the laws of the real world had been suspended. He even reached his curse into the main event. At WrestleMania, Xiango came charging out to interfere in the enormous showdown between Hulk Hogan and Sid Justice, throwing the whole thing into chaos and helping set the stage for the triumphant return of the Warrior. A monster whose power was so unnatural that no single feud could contain him. And the World Wrestling Federation leaned hard into this kind of darkness, because Shango was not alone in the shadows. Looming over all of it was the Undertaker, the dead man himself, a creature who came from Death Valley, who felt no pain, who sat bolt upright after being knocked down like a corpse, refusing to accept its own grave. His ghoulish manager, Paul Bearer, clutching a golden urn that seemed to hold the dead man's very soul. There was the deranged, glassy-eyed Damien Demento, a man who claimed to take his marching orders from voices echoing inside his own head. These were not athletes. They were nightmares wearing wrestling boots. The company even built whole new kinds of matches around this darkness, burying its monsters and its heroes alike inside caskets and body bags, turning a wrestling ring into a graveyard. The point was never really the wrestling. The point was the dread, the slow crawl of fear up the back of your neck when the lights went out and you could not be sure what would be standing there when they finally came back on. That is the leap level 3 makes. The indestructible monster scares you because you cannot beat him. The supernatural monster scares you because you cannot understand him. You can train your whole life to fight another man. How on earth do you train to fight a curse? But here is the truth that holds the supernatural back. The magic was theater. The smoke and the ooze and the lights, brilliant and unnerving as they were, lived in the world of make-believe, and a clever crowd eventually sees the trick behind the curtain. To climb to the next level, a monster cannot rely on illusions and special effects. He has to be genuinely, frighteningly real. Level 4. The Legitimate Beast. Everything up to this point has been a performance. A costume, a gimmick, a carefully designed reason to be afraid. But at level 4, the fear stops being a work and starts being a fact. This is the monster the rest of the locker room genuinely did not want to be in the ring with. Not because a writer decided he was dangerous, but because he actually, legitimately was. The one whose offense left real bruises that did not fade for a week. The one who, if you ever crossed him, would drop the act entirely and hurt you for real. The patron saint of this level is Vader. He arrived in the World Wrestling Federation as a 450-pound mountain hidden behind a steam-belching horned mastodon mask, and he moved with a kind of violence that simply did not match anyone else on the roster. Long before he ever got there, Vader had become a global legend for his sheer brutality, the man who had crushed and conquered the beloved Sting in their home promotion, whose splash off the top rope landed like a falling building, and whose idea of a wrestling match sat uncomfortably close to an actual fight. He did not work soft. He clubbed people. Opponents came back from a night with Vader genuinely rattled and marked up, telling stories for years about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of all that weight thrown with bad intentions. When he debuted in the Royal Rumble, he did not simply eliminate men. He brutalized them, and then turned on the legendary gentle Gorilla Monsoon at ringside just to prove a point. And there is one story that tells you everything about the legitimate beast. While touring the Middle East, Vader appeared on a live morning television program in Kuwait. The host, on the air, in front of the whole country, asked him the oldest question in the entire business. He asked whether wrestling was fake. And Vader, instead of smiling and brushing it off like a media-trained professional, flipped the table over and went after the man, live, on the news. Because at level 4, the line between the character and the man is paper thin, and on a bad day, it disappears completely. The World Wrestling Federation locker room of that era was full of these men, the ones whose reputations were not invented by anyone. The most feared of them all was Haku, a soft-spoken Tongan who was, by the unanimous agreement of every single wrestler who ever shared a locker room with him, the most dangerous human being in all of professional wrestling. The stories about Haku in a real fight are the stuff of nightmares. Men left hospitalized, steel handcuffs snapped clean apart, a level of genuine primal toughness that made hardened veterans go quiet just talking about it. There was Dr. Death Steve Williams, a legitimate amateur wrestling and football monster who could shoot for real and tear a man in half. There was Bam Bam Bigelow, a 400-pound man covered head to toe in flame tattoos who could throw a drop kick like a cruiserweight and hit like a runaway truck. And later, there would be Ken Shamrock, billed quite accurately as the world's most dangerous man, an actual cage fighter who made grown men tap in fear. The Haku stories alone could fill a documentary of their own. Wrestlers swore he once broke a man's teeth off with 2 fingers, that it took more than a dozen police officers to subdue him on a single bad night, that he bit a piece clean off a man's face in a bar after the man made the mistake of calling wrestling fake. Whether every single detail is true almost does not matter. What matters is that the entire locker room believed it completely and behaved accordingly. That is the real difference between a monster who is written to be scary and a monster who simply is. You can rewrite a gimmick overnight. You cannot rewrite a reputation that took 20 years of genuine fear to build. That is the leap Level 4 makes. The supernatural monster scares you with an illusion. The legitimate beast scares you with the truth. He stands across the ring and lets you remember in the pit of your stomach that the violence does not entirely stop when the camera turns off. But even the legitimate beast has a ceiling. He is dangerous. He is feared. He is the man nobody wants to anger. But raw danger alone does not put gold around your waist. To climb higher, a monster has to do the one thing that all of these terrifying men below him could never quite manage. He has to actually win the big one. Level 5. The Conqueror. Everything we have talked about so far has been about fear. The fear of chaos, the fear of invulnerability, the fear of the supernatural, the fear of real and present danger. But fear is not the same thing as a championship. You can terrify the entire world and still, when the bell finally rings, hand the title back to the hero and walk away with absolutely nothing. The Berserker never won the big one. Zeus never won it. Vader, for all of his menace, was kept at arm's length from it. At level 5, the monster stops scaring the throne and finally, brutally, sits down on it. And no monster ever sat on it more completely than Yokozuna. He was billed as a sumo grand champion, an immense man announced at well over 500 pounds, escorted to the ring by the wily, salt-throwing Mr. Fuji. His finisher was the dreaded bonsai drop, where he would climb to the second rope and crash his entire seated weight down onto a flattened opponent, a move that looked genuinely capable of stopping a heart. He spoke not a single word on camera. He moved slowly and deliberately, like a glacier with bad intentions. And for a long, suffocating stretch of the early 1990s, he was the single most dominant force in the entire company. Watch how completely he conquered. Yokozuna won the Royal Rumble, last eliminating the Macho Man Randy Savage to earn his championship shot. He flattened the patriotic hero Hacksaw Jim Duggan. He stood on the deck of a battleship on the 4th of July and issued a body slam challenge, daring all of America to lift him, and hero after hero after hero failed in front of a national audience. And then, he did the very thing the Conqueror is built to do. At WrestleMania, he beat Bret Hart for the World Championship. Months later, at King of the Ring, he flattened Hulk Hogan himself and took the title a second time. Two of the most beloved heroes in the history of the company, beaten on the grandest stages of all by the same enormous, silent villain. He fought The Undertaker in a casket match and needed an entire army of villains just to help bury the dead man inside. He headlined WrestleMania again, defending his gold in the closing match of the show, the immovable mountain sitting at the very center of the whole promotion. And look at what it finally took to topple him. To pry the championship loose, the company needed the patriotic strongman Lex Luger. An entire summer of failed body slam attempts on the deck of that battleship, two different heroes earning title shots at the same WrestleMania, and ultimately, Yokozuna's own enormous weight betraying him as he slipped at the very top of the Banzai drop. Even his downfall had to be staged like a freak accident, the mountain collapsing under its own size rather than being knocked over. That is how carefully a true conqueror has to be protected. Heroes do not simply beat a monster like that. They mount entire campaigns against him, and the whole map of the company bends around wherever he happens to be standing. And the conqueror is a rare and special kind of monster, one the World Wrestling Federation had crowned only a handful of times across the decades. Long before Yokozuna, there was the Iron Sheik, the snarling, boot-loving villain who locked the beloved Bob Backlund in the camel clutch and squeezed the championship right out of the company's hands, holding the entire World Wrestling Federation hostage until a young, sun-tanned Hulk Hogan rose up to slay him and begin an empire. There was Sergeant Slaughter, the all-American hero who turned his back on his own country, and as a hated turncoat actually ripped the title away from the Ultimate Warrior. And there was Diesel, the 7-foot powerhouse who flattened Backlund in a matter of seconds to capture the gold and carry it for the better part of a year. These were the monsters who did not merely threaten the hero, they took everything he had and wore it around their waists. That is the leap level 5 makes. The legitimate beast makes the danger real. The conqueror makes the nightmare come true. He proves the hero is not safe, that the monster can win, that the very worst thing can actually happen. And every reign like his makes the eventual hero who finally topples him look 10 feet tall on the way back up. But even the conqueror has a limit. His dominance lived inside the title picture, inside the wins and the losses of the storyline. There is a kind of monster who is bigger than the championship itself, a monster so utterly massive that he does not even need the belt, because his very presence in the building is the main attraction. A monster who is not just in the show, he is the show. Level 6, the Living Monument. At level 5, the monster wins the title. At level 6, the monster becomes something the title simply cannot contain. This is the tier of pure, overwhelming, event-defining mass, the monster so enormous that the entire card bends around him, the attraction the company builds its biggest nights upon. He does not need to be the champion to matter. He needs only to be impossible, a wall of a man whose mere existence reshapes everything and everyone around him. And the perfect monument to this level is King Kong Bundy. They called him the Walking Condominium, and the name was earned. Bundy was a bald, sneering mountain Indian in a black singlet, a man so wide that the commentators could not stop arguing about his true weight live on the air. But size was never his whole story. Bundy understood cruelty. When he flattened an opponent and pinned him, he refused to allow the referee to count to 3. He demanded a count of 5. 2 extra slaps of the canvas, every single time, just to humiliate the broken man underneath him. Just to announce to the entire arena that a normal 3-count victory was beneath a creature of his magnitude. It was the small, sadistic detail that turned a giant into a genuine villain. And in 1986, Bundy became the event itself. After he ambushed Hulk Hogan and crushed his ribs with avalanche after avalanche on national television, the World Wrestling Federation built the entire main event of WrestleMania 2 around one terrifying image: the champion locked inside a steel cage with the monster who had already broken him once. Hogan escaped that cage with the title, but the picture of the hero desperately scaling those steel walls to get away from Bundy became one of the defining images of the era. That is what a living monument does. The hero does not so much beat him as survive him. And Bundy was such a monument that he was even given the honor, years later, of stepping into the ring with The Undertaker on the grandest stage, becoming one of the bodies in that growing, unbeatable streak. The World Wrestling Federation was a land of these giants, and they towered everywhere you looked. There was Big John Studd, who walked around with a duffel bag full of cash, offering $15,000 to any man on the roster who could lift him off his feet and body slam him, smugly certain that no human being ever could. There was Earthquake, a 460-pound former sumo who literally shook the ring when he moved, and who crushed Hulk Hogan so savagely on a talk show that the hero vanished from television for 2 solid months, while a worried nation wondered whether his career was finished for good. There was Giant Gonzalez, billed at an absurd and unforgettable 8 feet tall, the single largest human being the company ever presented. A man who nearly ended The Undertaker's streak before it had even properly begun. And there was the 500-pound King Mabel, a monster so enormous that he was handed his own pay-per-view main event against the very top star in the company. These were not wrestlers you carefully booked into a feud. They were spectacles you built an entire show around. Earthquake did not even stop at one monument. He found a second one in Typhoon, another mountain of a man, and together as the natural disasters, they became a 2-headed wrecking crew that could flatten an entire tag division just by sitting on it. Big John Studd, meanwhile, turned his bag of money and his body slam challenge into appointment television, because every week another brave soul stepped up to try, and every week the Giant stood firm and laughed, until the whole country was desperate to see somebody, anybody, finally put him on his back. That is the strange power of the living monument. He turns the simple question of whether anyone is big enough into the only storyline the show even needs. That is the leap level 6 makes. The conqueror wins the match. The monument becomes the reason people bought the ticket in the first place. His sheer scale is the story all by itself. But there is one rung still above him. Because as enormous as Bundy and Studd and Earthquake and Gonzalez all were, every single one of them spent his career standing in the shadow of one particular giant. A giant so legendary that all the others were really just chasing what he already effortlessly was. A giant who did not merely headline the show, he transcended the entire business. Level 7. The 8th Wonder. This is the top of the mountain, the apex. Every monster on this list was frightening in his own particular way. The Wild Man and the Wall, the Witch Doctor and the Beast, the Conqueror and the Monument. But there is one creature who combined the menace of all of them and then did something that none of them ever could. He stepped outside of wrestling entirely and became a phenomenon the whole world recognized. A name your grandmother knew. A draw so massive that the single biggest night in the company's history was built entirely upon the day he finally turned bad. His name was André the Giant, the 8th wonder of the world. And there has never been, before or since, another monster quite like him. For 15 straight years, the World Wrestling Federation told the world one simple, unshakable story. André the Giant had never been slammed, and André the Giant had never been beaten. He was an undefeated, immovable colossus, a gentle traveling attraction who sold out every arena on the planet simply by showing up and waving to the children. And because he was so beloved, because he was such a hero, the menace inside him was a sleeping giant in the most literal sense. Until the World Wrestling Federation decided to wake it up. In early 1987, on an episode of Piper's Pit, André walked out alongside the single most devious manager in the entire company, Bobby the Brain Heenan. The crowd could not believe what they were seeing. Heenan, Hogan's oldest and greatest enemy, was now guiding the giant by the arm. And then André did the unthinkable. He challenged his own best friend, Hulk Hogan, for the championship, and he reached out and tore the shirt and the crucifix necklace right off Hogan's chest. The friendliest giant in the entire world had become, in a single breathtaking moment, the most terrifying villain alive, and he had done it by betraying the one hero that everybody loved. What followed was the biggest match the business had ever produced. At WrestleMania 3, in front of a building packed with more than 90,000 screaming people, an indoor attendance record that would stand for decades, the irresistible force finally met the immovable object. André wrestled that night in agony, his enormous body failing him, a back brace hidden beneath his singlet. The whole world held its breath to see if Hogan could even lift the giant off his feet, and when the champion finally scooped André up and slammed him to the mat before dropping the leg for the win, it became the single most famous moment in the history of professional wrestling. The body slam heard around the world. And the only reason it meant so much, the only reason anyone still remembers it, is the monster who was on the other side of it. But André was not finished. On a February night in 1988, on national network television, in front of a staggering audience of more than 30 million people, the largest crowd ever to watch a wrestling match in America, the Giant got his rematch. And through a crooked scheme involving a pair of identical twin referees, André did what no monster on this entire list ever managed. He pinned Hulk Hogan, clean in the eyes of the law, in the middle of the ring. He took the World Championship. And then, in the single most villainous act imaginable, he turned around and handed that title to the evil million-dollar man Ted, who had purchased the Giant's services like a man buying a weapon off a shelf. The hero had finally, truly been beaten, on the biggest stage of all, by the apex monster. And the Giant was a one-man wrecking ball wherever the company chose to point him. At the very first Survivor Series, André captained a team of villains, the One-Man Gang, King Kong Bundy, Butch Reed, and Rick Rude among them, and stood as the sole survivor, the last man left standing while every hero fell around him. When the championship he had stolen was finally vacated and thrown into a tournament at WrestleMania 4, it took a double disqualification just to remove him from the bracket, because the company could not stomach the idea of the Giant being cleanly pinned. He was too important. He was simply too big. And outside the ring, his fame stretched into places no other wrestler of his era could dream of reaching, into films and television, and the imagination of millions of people who had never once bought a ticket to a wrestling show in their lives. And here is the detail that tells you exactly how high André sat above everyone else in this video. Every Giant we have discussed was, in some way, chasing him. Big John Studd built his entire career trying to prove he belonged in the same conversation as André. King Kong Bundy collided with him in a series of battles billed as Clashes of the Titans, even claiming to have broken the Giant's sternum. André later roamed the company alongside the most dangerous men in the locker room, even forming a tag team with the legitimately terrifying Haku, a duo they called the Colossal Connection. And yet, by the account of his own manager, Bobby Heenan, there were only two men in the entire world that André the Giant himself was ever afraid of. Think carefully about what that means. The monster that every other monster feared kept a short list of his own, and it had only two names written on it. That is the rarefied, impossible air at the very summit of this mountain. That is what Level 7 truly means. The monument becomes the show. The eighth wonder becomes the world. André did not raise the hero up simply by being a great obstacle in a match. He became the measuring stick for every Giant who came after him. The impossible standard the entire business is somehow still chasing to this very day. When people who have never watched a single second of wrestling in their lives close their eyes and picture a monster looming in a ring, the image that appears in their minds is André the Giant. So there it is, the 7 levels of the World Wrestling Federation monster heel, from the very bottom of the mountain all the way to the top. It begins with the Raving Savage, the wild man too far gone to follow the rules. It rises to the Indestructible, the wall the hero cannot knock down. It climbs to the Supernatural, the creature who curses you from the dark. It sharpens into the legitimate beast, the danger that is frighteningly, genuinely real. It reaches the Conqueror, the monster who finally takes the gold. It swells into the living monument, the giant who becomes the entire show. And it ends, at the very top, with the eighth wonder, the phenomenon who stepped out of wrestling and into history. What ties all 7 levels together is a single, simple truth about this strange and beautiful business. The hero is never the most important person in the story. The monster is. Because the monster decides how brave the hero has to be. The bigger the nightmare, the greater the dream of beating it. Every chant, every comeback, every roar when the good guy finally slays the beast, all of it is built squarely on the back of the villain who made that victory feel impossible in the first place. That is why we still remember them, all these years later. The Viking with his sword, the movie monster who felt no pain, the witch doctor and his black ooze, the masked beast who flipped the table, the silent sumo who took the crown, the walking condominium and his 5 count, and the giant who became a true wonder of the world. They were the monsters, and without them, there would never have been any heroes at all. Drop a comment and let us know which monster heel terrified you the most, and tell us who you think deserved a spot on the list. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the golden age of professional wrestling, and we will see you in the next one.